For this video, I want to do a quick example for the Schedule 8812, which is the credits for qualifying children and other dependents. So this is the child tax credit, the other dependent credit, and the additional child tax credit. All of that gets reported on the 8812. So this is going to be a 2024 example. We've got the 8812 here, which we'll go through in its entirety, and it is part of the full 1040, so we'll cover where these credit amounts get reported on the 1040 as well. But before we get into the example, just one slide here covering some background on these credits and more details on the fact pattern that we're going to be working with. So the child tax credit for 2024, so this is the 2024 tax year, and these are returns that are being filed in 2025. The CTC amount for 2024 is $2,000 per qualifying child, and these are children that are under 17 at the end of the year. The additional child tax credit, which is the refundable portion of the CTC, is a maximum of $1,700 for 2024, and you can see in prior years it was a little less. So it was $1,600 in 2023, $1,500 in 2022. Now, there's a lot of confusion that often happens with respect to these two credits, and that people think that they're separate, in that they're separate amounts and you can kind of add them together, right? Well, these are not separate amounts. So in other words, if you're thinking, well, a taxpayer can claim a $2,000 child tax credit, and then they can go get this additional child tax credit for $1,700, add the two together, get $3,700 in total credits. That is not what's happening here. It's a bit misleading that they call it the additional child tax credit, because it is not an additional credit. What the additional child tax credit is, it is a part of the $2,000 child tax credit that is the refundable portion. So the CTC generally is a non-refundable credit, meaning that you can use it to offset your tax liability dollar for dollar, but when it gets down to zero, the credit is lost, right? You can't get a refund once your tax liability is down to zero, at least not a refund from this credit. The ACTC allows for the potential for a refund, and that's what we're going to see in this example when we get to it. Now, in order to get the additional child tax credit, you have to have some earned income, and we'll see that when we get to part 2 of the form, that you've got to have at least some earned income in order to get it, and your adjusted gross income has to be below certain thresholds. Otherwise, it's phased out and you can't claim it. And so we'll look at those details later on in the video. So qualifying child for CTC purposes, this is always important, right? The qualifying child test for the tax credit is different than just a qualifying child to be a dependent, right? Different standards. Namely, the big one is always the age test. A lot of parents are surprised to learn that you only get the child tax credit if your child is under 17 at the end of the year. So if they're 17, if they're 18, still in high school, living at home, they're your dependent, but they're not going to be eligible for the child tax credit. You might be able to get the other dependent credit, but not this $2,000 CTC amount. Now, the phase out's always important to remember. If your income exceeds these relevant thresholds, then you have to start phasing out. In other words, reducing the amount of child tax credit. And at a certain point, you've arguably, in the eyes of the IRS, have made too much money and you don't get a credit at all, right? Okay, so now let's have a look at the fact pattern, and then we'll get into the 8812. So in our fact pattern here, we've got Jane Smith. She's filing as head of household, and she has one son, Adam, age 7, at the end of the year. And so Adam meets the qualifying child test for the CTC. He lives with her full time. He doesn't provide more than half his support, meets the age test, has a valid SN, all the requirements have been met. Now, as far as Jane's income here, she has W-2 wages of $40,500, and her total AGI is $40,505. So she has some investment income in there. Now, what we're going to see is that she qualifies for the $2,000 credit, but she doesn't have enough tax liability to be able to absorb the whole credit. And so then that's why we kick it over to the ACTC to see if she can use some of that leftover amount. All right, so let's look at the return. Hopefully this will make a little more sense when you actually see the numbers on paper. So if we start with page 1 of our 1040, look at the income information. So again, we can see there's her earned income, her wages, W-2 box 1. She has some interest income earned on her savings account, and so her total AGI is $40,505. As a head of household, she gets a standard deduction of $21,900. So her total taxable income, $18,605, and her tax liability here is $1,904. So now that she's got those items in place, she knows her income, she knows her tax liability on the taxable income. How does she complete the 8812? Well, starting with part 1, line 1, line 11 is your adjusted gross income. So we've got $40,505 is her AGI. Lines 2A through 2C are blank because we don't have any of these adjustments, but if they apply to you, then you have to make them. So if you're excluding any income earned while in Puerto Rico, if you have the foreign earned income exclusion on the 2555, you'll need an adjustment. And then Form 4563 relates to residents of American Samoa, have certain exclusions available. You have to make those adjustments. In this case, they don't apply to us, so we've left them blank. Now, the number of qualifying children under 17 that have the Social Security number, in this case, we have one, right? She has one dependent. That's a qualifying child. So on line 5, we multiply $2,000 times 1, and we're left with $2,000 reported on line 5. Now, if you have other dependents that are over the age of 16, so 17 or older, and they're still your dependents, you might get the other dependent credit, which is the reduced $500 amount. That information would be reported on line items 6 and 7. But in our case, Jane just has the one son, so we're claiming the child tax credit, and those ODC amounts are left blank. Now, line 8, we add up lines 5 and 7. We're left with $2,000, and so now we start to enter the potential phase-outs. So on line 9, enter the amount based on your filing status. Well, we're filing as head of household, so we're going to use $200,000. We enter that on line 9. And then line 10, we are subtracting line 9 from line 3. And if it's 0 or less, which it is, we just enter 0. So Jane's adjusted gross income up here is less than $200,000, meaning she doesn't have to worry about the phase out, right? Her income is below the threshold, so there's no $50 reduction in the credit for every $1,000 her income exceeds that threshold. So we've left that at 0. Line 11 is just going to be 0, right? 0 times 5% is 0. And so the amount of credit available here is going to be $2,000. So it asks us, is the amount on line 8 more than the amount on line 11? Well, in this case, the answer is yes, right? So our line 8 amount is $2,000. Our line 11 amount is 0. So we subtract line 11 from line 8 and enter the $2,000 on line 12. Now, this is where the credit limit comes into play, and then eventually we move on to the additional child tax credit. So remember, I stated earlier when we were looking at the slides that the child tax credit is a non-refundable credit. So you've got to have some tax liability in order to be able to leverage this credit, right? That's the base starting rule. So when we looked at Jane's 1040 page 2, we can see here that, okay, she does owe some taxes. She's at $1,904 on line 18. So there is some tax liability, but there's not enough to be able to claim the entire $2,000, right? Because she only has $1,904 of tax liability on her taxable income. So we have to look at the credit limit worksheet here and figure out how much we're going to be able to claim. So this is the credit limit worksheet for the Schedule 8812. You can find this in the schedule instructions. The starting point here is the tax, right, on line 18 of the Form 1040. So that's on page 2. We have $1,904. Now, before you apply the child tax credit against this amount, you have to make certain adjustments. And so those adjustments are found on Schedule 3. So I've got a sample Schedule 3 here. You can see additional credits and payments. So you would make adjustments for things like claiming the foreign tax credit, or claiming the child and dependent care expenses on 2441 or education credits. So if you have any of these line items from Schedule 3, you have to account for those first before you apply your child tax credit. In this example, we don't have those, right? Jane's got a pretty straightforward return. She doesn't have any foreign tax credits. She's not claiming any other dependent care credits and so on. So all of these line items are blank, so it leaves the 1904 unadjusted from above. Now, Worksheet B may be required if all of these following elements apply. So if you're claiming one of these following credits and you're not filing the foreign earned income exclusion, and line 4, the number of qualifying children is more than 0, then you have to complete Worksheet B. In Jane's case here, she meets the number 2 and 3 elements, right? She's not filing the foreign earned income exclusion. She does have a line 4 amount more than 0. She has one qualifying child, so it's more than 0. But she's not claiming one of these credits up here. So she's not claiming the mortgage interest credit, adoption, residential clean energy, or the DC buyer's credit. So for that reason, we can skip Worksheet B. Don't have to apply it. So the end of the day here, line 5, the credit limit amount is going to be $1,904. And so that's what's reported on the 8812 line 13. So the amount from the credit limit worksheet A is $1,904. Now, based on the credit limit amount, we can figure out how much our child tax credit is actually going to be. And so on line 14, it asks us to enter the smaller of line 12 or line 13. Well, the smaller item here is going to be the line 13 amount. So she has a $2,000 credit available, but not enough tax liability to be able to absorb the entire amount. So the credit is going to be limited to $1,904. The non-refundable credit is, that is. All right, so if we take this number and we have it flow back up to page 2, we can see here line 19, child tax credit or credit for other dependents from the 8812. There we report our 1904 figure. And when we subtract the total tax from the 1904 figure, it zeroes it out. So the line 24 total tax that Jane has on her return right now is been whittled down to $0 because she was able to use the credit. But now Jane asks, well, I see I used 1904 of the child tax credit, but I had $2,000 to start with. Can I do anything with that difference, or is it lost? And this is where the ACTC comes in. So if you look at the additional child tax credit, so this is Part 2A of the form Schedule 8812, this is where you calculate whether you can reclaim any of that lost credit that wasn't able to be used initially in Part 1. Now, the ACTC, a lot of people will find that when they get to this part, the excess amounts are lost, right? They can't claim any amount of ACTC, but in this example, it's been set up in such a fashion where she will be able to get it. So line 16A, we're going to subtract line 14 from line 12 above, right? So if I go back up here, line 14, 1,904, subtracted from 2,000 gives us $96. So $96 is the excess, the piece that we couldn't use initially. Now, 16B, enter the number of qualifying children under 17 that have the SSN. In our case, it's 1. And there you can see the $1,700 maximum ACTC amount for the 2024 tax year. In 2023, that amount was $1,600, and it was even lower in 2022. So $1,700 is going to be the maximum amount of refundable credit that we're going to be able to claim here. All right. Now, line 17 asks us to enter the smaller of line 16A or 16B. Well, in this case, the smaller amount is 96, right? This is the amount that was left over. So we're going to enter $96 on 17. So this is now potentially the amount of additional child tax credit we can claim, assuming we are able to meet the remaining tests with respect to the earned income. So now, line 18A, earned income, we report all of our earned income from line 1 of the 1040. So $40,500 is our W-2 wages up here, okay? Now notice how it doesn't include the interest, right? So we're not using adjusted gross income here. We're using earned income only. That's really important. In order to claim the ACTC, you've got to have a certain amount of earned income, otherwise you're not eligible for it. So we've got $40,500. 18B is blank for us. We don't have any non-taxable combat pay. Line 19 asks, is the amount on 18A more than $2,500? And the answer is yes, right? So we can subtract $2,500 from the amount on 18A, and we're left with $38,000. So we have $40,500 minus $2,500 gives us $38,000. And on line 20, it wants us to multiply the $38,000 times 15%, which leaves us $5,700. All right. Now, last question, right? On to line 20. We multiply the amount on line 19 by 15%, enter the 5,700, and it's asking us if on line 16B, is the amount $5,100 or more, so we have $1,700, and the answer is no, right? So this amount isn't greater, the $1,700 isn't greater than the $5,100. So we can skip, and we're not a bona fide resident in Puerto Rico, so skip part 2B down here and enter the smaller of line 17 or line 20 on line 27. Well, the smaller amount between 17 and 20 is that $96 figure. So we're going to enter the $96 down here on line 27. All right. So part 2C, the ACTC, this is your additional child tax credit. Enter this amount on the 1040 line 28. So our $96, we go back to page 2. And on line 28, you can see there we have our additional child tax credit from 8812, $96. So these credit amounts down here are increasing the refund for Jane. All right. You can also see that she has the earned income credit there. Not covering it in this video. I've got separate videos on that. I'll put all those links below. But these amounts are increasing her credit. So in Jane's case here, what we can see is that she did get the full $2,000 child tax credit at the end of the day, right? It's just a difference in where it was reported and what's the character. So we can see she had $1,900, $1,904 of the credit reported up here, right, as the non-refundable child tax credit. And then the extra amount, $96, was reported as the ACTC. But if you add those two together, you get the $2,000. So it's a bit, it can be a bit of a cumbersome calculation depending on your tax profile. But you can see here that Jane was able to claim the full amount. It was just reported in different areas and claimed under different rules. So hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to leave a comment below. And as always, I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.